Mr. Coffman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, thanks so much for your service. My concern is we're at an untenable position with Russia right now, and I want to get clarification of Article 5, your interpretation of it, because they've developed a hybrid system, or sort of a, I guess you could call it hybrid tactics that involve information operations, I guess you could say an element of psychological warfare, as well as using covert forces as proxies. And so when we look at something like the Baltic states that I think have Russian minorities in them, much like the Ukraine, that they could do the same pattern there. And I'm concerned that that NATO would acquiesce to that because they might not consider it a conventional attack under Article 5. What's your interpretation of that?
Well, first of all, NATO recognizes the difficulty in indirect or asymmetric activity that Russia is practicing, activities below the level of conflict. And in fact, we've inserted that for the first time into our NATO exercise that we did this past year with some ambiguous activities that are consistent with what they would typically do in order to bring this about and have that discussion at 29. And so they're actually dealing with the issue around this and in cyber and working to define an understanding of what would be a trigger for Article 5. So they're working that and they recognize it. I would just share with you that's the most difficult scenario I see potentially, is because of the way that they typically work in a fashion that would be ambiguous. It would be most difficult to come to a decision. But I would share that NATO's aware of this and they're actually working on it.
But don't you think that you said that that's the most difficult scenario? Don't you think that's the most probable scenario right now? And don't you think one of the objectives of Russia clearly is to break NATO and to test this, for instance, in one of the Baltic states?
I think that absolutely they're trying to undermine and splinter NATO. It is a difficult situation when they operate that way, but I'm confident of NATO. I've seen the discussions, and I think in something that they agree is an attack warning, Article 5, that they can come together. I've seen them come together in other things less than this. That was perhaps divisive at the time, but they can reach a conclusion.
Well, let me express to you that I don't necessarily share the confidence in our allies because of that was an agreed upon 2% of growth of GDP to be spent on defense, and the majority of our NATO allies are nowhere near that 2% requirement, and so it's you know, is it that, well, obviously they have other priorities within their budget, but that's a real concern when they're not doing that, and there's an over-reliance upon the United States. Could you comment on that?
I share your concern, and I press that as well as the Secretary General. I press it as the SACEUR and as a EUCOM commander every place I go. They have to demonstrate a change. They have, as I stated in my opening statement. There will be 8 that have made that 2% and 15 that plan to make it, and we'll continue to press that. As being a part of the alliance is also contributing as a part of the alliance, both in cash and contributions and capability. So that's what we're watching, and I agree that we need to press that. I would add that if you look at NATO and say since Warsaw, for instance, in the adaptation, the recognition is Russia as a threat here, a competitive nation. All of those things that I noted about the forward posture of troops in the East, our air policing activity, a much more increased maritime activity, particularly in the Black Sea and the Baltics. Everything that I do there as a SACEUR was agreed at 29. That's why I have confidence in in NATO. These are tough decisions for them and within their countries, and they've been able to act over the past year.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Veazey.